So the title of this talk is Violence, Conflict, and the Art of the Political. And we humans are fond of telling ourselves a particular fable about the history of the human condition. Often it begins with the tale of two prehistoric hominids, which, becoming more vertical in their posture, hence more human-like in their elevated modes of perception and ability to see the world from a different angle of vision, make the most necessary of discoveries, the creation of fire. We often picture these pre-political, pre-philosophical beings dwelling in some dark, desolate, and dank cave, lonely, uncomfortable, huddled together in a way that is devoid of love, compassion, and the joys of existence, while protecting themselves from the brutal outside environment and the odd marauding saber-toothed tiger lurking at the doors. Armed with fire, however, everything changes. Soon the hominids become more confident and self-assured. They become gatherer-hunters, and even have the time to entertain themselves by painting nice images on the cave walls, just for the sake of it. Thus begins what we might call a natural history of violence, out of which humankind learns to deal with the insecure sediment of its existence. The rest of the story is very familiar to the Western political and historical imagination. With this most precious element now at our mastery and effective disposal, or so we like to think, soon the human species develops iron, steel, and other technologies for earthly conquest, leading to centuries of battle and violence forged during darker periods of human evolution. Importantly, the darker periods here don't refer in the grand scheme of things to the technologies that humans actually produced, despite all their violent intents and purposes. The darkness of being human pointed, in fact, to the species was seen to be living in a state of nature, living as an unruly, ungoverned, disaggregated, and to use the discursive language of the so-called Enlightenment, savage mass. Then came the English Civil War, ripping apart the still darkened serenity of the otherwise beautiful English countryside, which compelled an observant Thomas Hobbes to write at the time that left to this state of nature, the life of man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. With the Leviathan keeping a watchful eye over the people, thus begins the modern theory of sovereignty, which, setting in place the notion that there's no politics without security and there's no security without the state, replaced the state of nature with a very real state of terror. Order was to be maintained and hierarchy naturalized through the force of law and the monopolization over the means of violence to prevent any return to social disintegration and some form of chaotic anarchy. Now, as is well documented, the subsequent shift from princely states to colonial appropriation, exploitation, and dissection of the planet and its people eventually gave rise to the emergence of the world of nations, born of various secular dreams. Such dreams and phantasmal visions went by the name of ideology. Displacing earlier theological forms of allegiance and disagreement, this period of human history also gave rise to the myth of nations and new claims of supremacy, something that was wonderfully captured by George Orwell, who seems to be in the media a lot recently, valorized by the British state, who noted, "By nationalism, I mean, first of all, the habit of categorizing human beings like insects, so whole blocks of millions or tens of millions can be conveniently labeled good or bad." This conception of nationalism and its increasing materialized sovereign divisions and tensions was purposefully developed and rigorously articulated by the German theorist Carl Schmitt, who put forward his idea that sovereignty was ultimately nothing more than the ability to decide who was the friend to be secured and who was the enemy to be vanquished. Sovereignty, as Schmitt maintained, was nothing more than the ability to decide upon the state of the exception, which was just as important in defining whom was to be included as what was to be abandoned. Starting then from the basic premise that humans were born into a violent state of nature, and this violence in turn required a taming of the natural world and the monopolization over the means of endangerment to bring about internal peace, the world was subjected to a permanent state of emergency, in which conflicting ideas about the good life, not to mention the desire to still appropriate what your neighbor possessed, resulted in a modern state theory full of entities constantly navigating a fraught political landscape of diplomacy and warfare. The trouble with those who possessed ideology, however, was that they tended to have no respect for sovereign integrities and internal visions of peace. Thus, as the 20th century developed, the modern theory of sovereignty was also accompanied by theories of resistance and revolution, which tapping into the anger and sense of disillusionment some felt with the progressive order of things, introduced terms such as vanguard, dialectics, and negation, or indeed, for those of you who are more theoretically bothered, the negation of negation into the political lexicon. Now, much of the theory here was relatively straightforward. The historical architecture of the world benefited certain elite groups. So in order to bring about genuine revolutionary change, you needed a small, educated cadre of committed revolutionaries who were willing to throw their bodies on the line. Well, actually, the bodies of those they instructed. After all, some revolutionaries are more important than others, by exposing the masses to all that was wrong within a given state of affairs. Resistance here thus begins as a form of negation, a profound disavowal or disagreement with the existing order of things. Like a fly caught on a web, trapped and screaming out in the hope of somehow being emancipated, the negator is often armed with a more righteous form of violence, with the hope of a better and more equitable future to come. So what we encountered here was a conflict between different logics of violence, one that was premised on the need to justify its instrumentality to maintain peace, forcefully waged against the revolutionary other, which argued that violence was somehow justified in emancipatory context in order to bring about more equitable ends for people. Now, all the while this was unfolding, liberals kept reading and appropriating Carl Schmitt in order to try and vanquish this most formidable of enemies. Now, fast forward to the 1990s. As the Berlin Wall fell, an ideological conflict was said by liberals to be condemned to the dustbin of history, and hence the modern theory of resistance and revolution too, because if there's no ideological conflict, then there's no authentic basis for resistance and revolution. So liberals set upon defeating Schmitt and dogmatic political realists once and for all. It wasn't that liberals disagreed with the reality presented here. On the contrary, many accepted that the world of individual sovereign entities operating in their own national interests was in reality dangerous and conceptually an affront to any universal predisposition. Schmitt and his allies weren't therefore dangerous because they spoke untruthfully or deceitfully. They were dangerous because they embodied the truth of the times. Thus, with ideological revolution largely settled, at least that's what Francis Fukuyama had us believe in his book, The End of History, in order for the world to be at peace, what was needed was the creation of a new global architecture for rule, which allowed us to overcome unnatural divisions that segregated humans into various enclaves. However, as the last 2 decades have shown, the problem for liberals is that its global allegiance that it claims hasn't been self-evidently or spontaneously realized. On the contrary, the more liberal regimes have proclaimed planetary peace, the more it is needed to declare and wage planetary war in the name of humanity complete, hence the oxymoronic term humanitarian warfare. The results, as we all know, have been devastating. We are now, it is fair to say, living in an age that appears to be terrifyingly normal. One where wars are so natural and technologically determined, they no longer even need to be declared. We are in a state where we might call beyond war, where war no longer even needs to be declared. And where once familiar demarcations between notions of inside and outside, friends and enemies, times of war and times of peace, have been put into political crisis. We are living in a state of what I have called dystopian realism, where the future now appears to us as an endemic terrain of catastrophe and crisis. So how might we conceptually rethink our way out of this? And perhaps more pressing, should we even bother? After all, even the most positive voices out there now seem to tell us that we're all eventually fated to our own extinction. Well, in the short time I have left here, I'd like to suggest that a purposeful way out of this quagmire is to rethink the political itself by having an alternative reading of the history of the human condition, where we bring into question the undoubtedly crude conflation between violent conflict and resistance. To do this, I want to open up some discussion on the relationship between violence and power, and link this to how we might see conflict and resistance in more affirmative and indeed artistic terms. In doing so, I'm trying to reach for a different concept of the political, one that is based on empathy, love, and human dignity and the political imagination, instead of endangerment to enmity to outright extinction. To begin this, I'd like to turn to Hannah Arendt's important 1969 essay, Reflections on Violence, which was originally published in the New York Review of Books. As Arendt wrote, "Power and violence are opposites. Where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy, but left to its own course, its end is the disappearance of power." What Arendt, of course, is gesturing towards here is the need to have a better conceptual understanding of power and violence as categories in the ordering of human affairs. Violence, she maintains, is actually the order of political impotence. Those who demand a recourse to violence effectively have no power at their disposal. The violent man is the one who cannot command others through the power of his ideas or the violent forcefulness of his means of his seduction. Note the evident gender move I'm making there. Okay. Now, there are, of course, a whole number of conceptual issues with this that we can't really explore here, and I do have some concerns with some of Arendt's crude essentializations, and sometimes a misplaced faith in the political agoria and the communication can save us. But I do think it's worth pursuing here in terms of reclaiming something out of the conceptual collapse we see today. Now, linking this at first to the question of power, we certainly owe a great deal to Michel Foucault for providing us with a more sophisticated understanding of power, its architectures, its structures, and its effects beyond the reductiveness of material explanations. Power, as Foucault suggested, was never totalizing, nor was it something that could be held like some possession, neatly boxed up and contained for us to pass around. Power has no essence at all. It is relational. It's a power relation, which points to a set of possible relations of forces, which can affect the dominated and the dominating alike. Indeed, since power is relational, by definition, it holds the potential for reversals of fortune, for the subversion of its effects, and for its potential disintegration. Power, in other words, is wholly dependent upon the capacity for struggle, conflict, and resistance. Without these capacities, there is no power relationship to speak of. What remains is the order of violence. There is, however, a number of important qualifications that need to be made here. It's not simply the case that violence is negative and power is positive. Violence can be just as much bound up with progressive narratives, as much as power can lead to forms of self-annihilation and political nihilism. 2, just because power is positive doesn't mean to say that all power is necessarily good. Indeed, fascism, as Gilles Deleuze maintained, is all about the positive manipulation of human desires, which emerge from a toxic combination of fear and emancipatory discourses, which nevertheless still ultimately represent a manic attack upon the political body. And 3, just because a person struggles against power doesn't mean to say that they will create the world anew. Too often, in fact, the impulse to resist either ends up mimicking the logic of the system, so that what is merely created is a changing of the guard, or it is dominated by what Michel Foucault called the sad militants of theory, who, caught in some dialectical bind, create nothing because they are too busy negating everything. But what this does mean is that conflict is an important quality, not only in terms of thinking about empowerment, but it is absolutely central to the theory of resistance, which, premised upon the affirmation of differences, takes us some way into understanding human creativity. Now, as I say this, probably in this room and elsewhere, I can already hear various political grumblings and voices of discontentment that would demand at this stage, once again, a return to the original question of violence. Is it not, after all, this vexed question of difference that gives rise to violence and conflict in the first place? That difference is the cause of many of the world's problems, is seemingly a foundational truism of modern political thought. Indeed, it is fair to say that we still largely operate within a Kantian image of thinking, where difference is seen as the unnecessary and dangerous impediment to the universalization and the inevitable unification of the human race. Now, those of you who are familiar with the implicit and the explicit racism of Kant's anthropological writings will note my irony there. But is it necessarily the case that difference, especially ontological difference, causes violence? When dealing with these issues, I am drawn here to both René Girard's work on violence and the sacred and Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, along with various other literary texts. Girard's thesis offers a theory of violence that is inextricably bound to tragedy and the tale of dispossession. And for those who are aware of Girard's work, he specifically relates this to Greek tragedy, and particularly the tale of King Oedipus, which he argues illustrates perfectly this tale of violence to overcome some previous form of dispossession and tragedy. Now, importantly for Girard, when he's decoding the Oedipus myth, he says, such violence is not a relation of difference, but is more defined by the logic of mimesis. And what he means by this, he says, at first, each of the protagonists believe they can quell the violence, and yet each succumbs to it. All are drawn unwittingly into a violent reciprocity, which they always think they are outside of because they initially came from outside, but mistake their position as a simply fundamental superiority. In other words, for Girard, violence is not about the order of difference, it's the order of trying to make something the same, the attempt to appropriate something into a universal standard. Or as he says, plunging into an opposition which reduces the protagonist into a uniform condition of violence, all claims of difference are eclipsed by the resurgence of reciprocity. I think this is perhaps what Jacques Derrida had in mind when he said, the rapport to self-identity is always a rapport to violence with the other, so that the notion of property, appropriation, and self-presence are essentially dependent upon some oppositional relation. Or putting it in more Girardian terms, everybody effectively becomes a double, insomuch as they become the sole object of a universal obsession for hatred. And it's here that the real strength of Frantz Fanon's text returns in its full brutal glory. For what Fanon understood precisely was that the violence of dispossession creates a mimetic situation, both in which the oppressor and the oppressed believed that everything can be solved by force. Hence, they end up resembling one another far more than they like to acknowledge. What is more, as Fanon maintained, non-violence in this situation actually appears like a gratuitous gift of violence, in that non-violence can only be achieved by the absolute supremacy of a single master, whose monopoly over the legitimate means of violence prevents any actual violent encounter. And this is why I would argue there is still a purposeful reading of Fanon's remarkable text, not as a prophecy or a call to arms, but as a warning against repeating the violence of the past, a violence based upon establishing degrees of sameness to some authentic standard, which in the process of a forced unification sees difference as a problem to be solved. Now, I'm now drawn here to Stellan Rye's silent horror movie, The Student from Prague, which was done in 1913, which has inspired a number of compelling literary and cinematic classics. In this tragic tale of poverty and violence, the impoverished student, Baldwin, makes a bargain with the devil as he exchanges his reflection for more earthly possessions. Upon eventually seeing himself, however, the student is avenged by an angry double that begins to wreak havoc as it seeks out revenge upon his own betrayal of his own shadow. Following this eventual violent confrontation the student has with his double, Baldwin shatters the mirror that is central to the plot and inevitably destroys the fantasy of endangerment which became the source of his afflicted curse. Inevitably, however, since the double was an essential element of this Faustian agreement, in killing the violent double, so the student kills himself. Such is the order of political nihilism, which is precisely a will to nothingness. If you kill the other in your own image, you end up killing the self too. Or as Fanon would say, through violence, all you produce is violent subjectivities. You become the monster you most despise. So what does this all mean for the way we are to rethink then effective resistance to the present? As I've already mentioned, while Hobbes taught us there can be no politics without security and no security without the state, it was Kant that encouraged us to believe there can be no security without universality and no universality without moral progress in the unification of the species. However, if Kant inaugurated the modern age, it's with Hegel and his theory of dialectics, notably picked up by Marx and many others, where modernity becomes problematic and its inner workings self-consciously theorized. Now, without becoming too theoretical, Hegel is seen by many as the founder of the modern theory of resistance. And its advocates have seen the dialectical no as providing an escape plan to the world. However, as Gilles Deleuze argues, dialectics is never about difference. It's simply about a difference of contradiction. By internalizing all possible experiences, as Frantz Fanon understood all too well, what the dialectic actually produces is a negative style of thought, which ensures that we're only capable of revealing an identity which is already conceived. I'm thinking perhaps of the debate that was taking place last night, where it became very dialectical between the national and class-based politics. Both of them were based on the premise of identities already preconceived as the authentic basis for moving forward and emancipating politics. Now, to explain what is politically at stake here in the present moment, I could do no better, and I apologize for introducing him so early in the morning, than to turn to the example of Donald Trump in the United States. He eventually had to appear sometime, so I might as well get him out of the way now. Now, Trump has seemingly summoned a retreat back into 20th century paradigms for thinking. Armed with the mantra, great again, he invokes a direct appeal to the logics of sovereignty, and in doing so makes a naked appeal to what Walter Benjamin called mythical violence. Now, it's perhaps no coincidence the advent of Trump has also seen a resurgence in criticisms of theorists such as Michel Foucault, where the shift towards so-called post-truth, as if we were ever in a truthful situation, but we're now in a post-truth situation, is neatly conflated with a certain post-enlightenment disposition devoid of the virtues of reason, rationality, and calm deliberation. Now, leaving aside the very nonsensical notion that Foucault and others disavowed all notions of truth, what has become interesting is the way in which orthodox thinkers recognize that Trump is actually a condition of possibility for marking out their own authentic and dogmatic positions. Indeed, not only have we seen a response to Trump, which even forgetting the recent history of liberal wars, now also retreats back into a certain liberal puritanicalism, armed with its own version of unquestionable truth. Once again, the world now appears to us in neat sovereign territories, full of neatly defined, clear dialectical markers and all its notable political indistinctions. Now, Trump has undoubtedly mobilized the politics of the visceral to devastating effect. He has liberated prejudice. In fact, it is a textbook case of what Wilhelm Reich called the mass psychology of fascism, and the manipulation of petty fears and insecurities of the everyday in order to bring about this liberation of prejudice. Or as Spinoza might have said, so that is how the masses learned to desire their own oppression as though it was their liberation. Trump has also mastered the art of distraction by inducing what Marxists will no doubt call a false consciousness. Trump's false consciousness is consciously dialectical. The nature of his folk retreat demands it. Treating the mode of perception in what Zygmunt Bauman calls a retrotopic way, i.e. an appeal to the past, to times that were never really that great for the vast majority of the citizens, he consciously invokes the term fake to create a consciousness around traditional sovereign markers, i.e. the state, the media, the political elites, which once appeared familiar, comforting, and secure in their knowledge production. In doing so, Trump can present himself as a familiar dialectical revolutionary, unapologetically mobilizing the anger and rage of the disenfranchised and the socially downtrodden. Such a dialectical move depends upon materializing power in the form of a reductive state object, against which conflict can be waged. The conflictual nature of power in this regard is very site-specific and even locatable on a map. To bring about a change in the nation's fortunes, all that's needed is to storm the palaces and bring about a material revolution in the halls of power. That the state might be fully immersed in the complex networks of global, political and financial rule beyond sovereign integrities is completely written out of the drama. One of the interesting things about both Trump and Brexit is there's no attempt whatsoever from those in power to change the nature of global capitalism. The problem here then is in the conceptualization, however, of the theory of resistance. As we know historically, such a dialectical account of the revolutionary and resistance always lends itself to an elite vanguardism. There is always the revolutionary figure who is always deeply compromised, who is always educated, who is always white, who is always male, and who has the educational foresight to say enough is enough. Publicly armed with a giant no at his disposal, the revolutionary man parades through the streets as a courageous hero for the people, talking the good fight and promising to bring about a fundamental transformation in the system while still appealing to pre-existing logics of power, justice and violence in the name of those he now claims to be servicing. What then is clearly required here is a different concept of resistance, which can bring about a more fundamental transformation in human relations in a more affirming way. Now, this brings me to two quotes by Gilles Deleuze, which I think are worth repeating here. The first, Deleuze argues, is that the final word on power is that resistance comes first. And the second quote by Deleuze is, to create is to resist. Now, for Deleuze, in his theory of resistance, then, resistance is not a negative process, but is a positive and creative force. To create is to resist. Now, that is not to say that people forcefully resist before they become dominated. But if we want to understand resistance, it must be ontologically situated in relation to the limitations and suffocations which are imposed upon people's subjectivities and differences. In that sense, that which is creative is forced to become resistive through modes of incorporation and denial. So where does this all leave us? The history of the modern subject, we are continually reminded, is one of survival against the odds. Thrown into the world, as Martin Heidegger once proclaimed, it has learned to adapt to whatever surroundings it has found itself in peril to inhabit, only to learn that the mastery of any given space was illusionary at best. The life of the subject upon this embattled terrain remained, as Nietzsche declared with more critical purchase than is often acknowledged, all too human. To live has been a story of endurance unto the end. And if it has been possible to write of any sense of progress, this amounts to a prolonging of the human existence so that we're able to cheat death for as long as possible. All the while, of course, the modern subject remains sure that its existence would eventually end, albeit in some yet-to-be discernible event. But are these narratives of human evolution and its accompanied stories of survival against the odds satisfactory? Could it not actually be the case that there is more to life than this ongoing tale of survival which frames the human through the insecure sediment of its existence? As Deleuze succinctly put it, in every modernity, in every novelty, you find conformity and creativity, an insipid conformity, but also a little new music. Something in conformity with the time, but also something remarkably untimely. Separating the one from the other is the task of those who know how to love, the real destroyers and the creators of our times. This was not lost on Foucault, who was also of the opinion that from the idea that the self is not given to us, I think there is only one practical consequence. We have to create ourselves as a work of art. So to offer you some form of, needless to say, for Foucault and Deleuze, this art of living finds political value in those poetic expressions which remain irreducible to life, namely love, empathy, compassion, and dignity, things that we know are all too real, but almost impossible to quantify in crude social scientific metrics. So to offer some form of conclusion, and I'm actually remarkably on time, which I was surprised at. I'd like to turn to what I believe is the most brilliant, imaginative, and revolutionary political text ever written. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. This beautifully crafted narrative begins with Alice chasing a white rabbit who has no time for anything. Could there be a better metaphor for the contemporary moment than this? In Carroll's Wonderland, the nonsensical is the rule. The exception has become the norm. It's a place full of injustice, where violence is completely arbitrary and power is unmediated. And let's consider the Queen. Is there a more fitting caricature of Donald Trump? She utters, therefore it is true. She speaks and it becomes the truth. But more important in this brilliantly crafted tale is Alice. She continuously learns to see things from different perspectives. Indeed, this little girl is a real revolutionary subject in the most affirmative sense of the term. Alice doesn't negate the world, she brings out its wonder. Alice doesn't hide away, she resists what is patently intolerable. Alice doesn't judge the strange fellows she meets on a journey, she accepts people for their differences. And most importantly of all, Alice doesn't lament the world because she is armed with the greatest weapon of all, the power of imagination. Thank you for listening.